Good evening, everybody. Please take your seat. So, on behalf of the three organizers, Multimedia Institute, Cursiv, and Kulturträger, and my colleagues who organized this event with me, Antonia, Mika, and Janja, I wish to welcome you to the conference Media Against Democracy. I want to spend a couple of minutes just explaining the meaning of this question. Given that the free media are commonly perceived as one of the few foundational aspects of democracy, the explanation is in order. What do we mean by this somewhat awkward and bluntly formulated question, media against democracy? This question has crystallized since the last summer as a consequence of two predicaments or two parallel crises. So as the news of Edward Snowden's leaks of the blanket surveillance of internet and other electronic communication started coming in last summer, our societies at large began slowly to face the realization that the democratizing promise of the early internet is gone. At the same time, and for a while now, we've been hearing the bad news of deep crisis that has befallen news media and journalism. Both print, electronic, and internet media are in a heady downward spiral of dwindling business, downsizing, layoffs, and bankruptcies. Only here in Croatia, to name just a few examples, the largest media conglomerate, Europa Press Holding private conglomerate, Europa Press Holding, owner of the four national dailies and a number of other specialized publications, has been recently saved from an 80 million euro bankruptcy. Two of the largest news portals, for instance, not to name them at the moment, have been radically restructured and downsized, changed the ownership. Public service has been shedding external workforce, freelancers that have been working on its program that are vital to its programmation and its quality. So this delineates this double predicament. And in this double predicament, we can recognize two historic processes, which are, I think, now only exacerbated with the enduring economic crisis, particularly in the smaller countries and markets such as ours. And they're creating a perfect storm both for the media and journalism. So firstly, we are seeing the full-blown consequences of disruptive technological transformation that has been brought about by the digital technologies and internet. While the technological change has revolutionized the access to information, shedding the material limitations to worldwide dissemination of information, and has democratized the access to the production of information, allowing everybody to speak to the global public, it has also undercut the business models of commercial print media, fragmented the audiences, and spurred the concentration at the top and marginalization at the bottom within its own digital domain. Secondly, and more importantly, we are now also seeing the full-blown consequences of the failure of the neoliberal market-oriented media policy. The idea that the market is the best safeguard and optimal format for the freedom of expression has been defeated on its own terms. Looking back in retrospect, this idea has become dominant for two reasons. On the one hand, as the consequence of the broader neoliberalization, where the belief in the market as the most efficient and neutral form of social provision has been expanded to include broader spheres of social reproduction, including, among others, the public debate and the media. And on the other, as the backlash following the downfall of socialist societies with their limited freedom of expression, resulting most commonly in the commercial media being taken for granted as the solutions to all regulatory dilemmas of control over freedom of expression, or of freedom of expression. However, the neoliberal media policy meant that the commercial model of media and news production has become the privileged model at the expense of the public and non-commercial media. That the state has withdrawn both in terms of ownership and regulation, and that the information in its form has increasingly become commodified regardless of the form of media and its ownership. This ascendancy of the neoliberal media policy was legitimated by a double ideological conflation. The freedom of expression became equated with the freedom of media corporations to do business increasingly unregulated. And the public debate became equated with the choices made in the marketplace of ideas. Hence, the truly free media were only the commercial media. Hence, the truly legitimate outcomes of the public debate were the ones which emerged victorious in the marketplace. Yet, this media policy resulted in a high concentration of media ownership and radically unequal media power, leaving less well-off segments of the society or interests adverse to the interests of media owners highly underrepresented in the public debate. And it certainly didn't result in commercial independent or free media. As we can observe across the localities and scale, the commercial media depend on other sources of revenue to sustain quality journalism. In our local context, these strategies were acquisition of media through privatization and later speculation with their real estate assets, or rampant expansion into entertainment business, or dependence on public subsidies, or simply partnering with other businesses where the media power can be used to advocate social policies beneficial to those particular business interests. Quality media are simply not sustainable in the market. Not even the prized news media papers with global readership, such as New York Times or Washington Post. They are, after all, pet projects of rich donors that can afford to keep them going by pumping billions into them. Hence, the commercial model of the free and independent press, to put it bluntly, this normative idea of the market as the effective mechanism of provisioning of information and the neutral mechanism of social deliberation, while still dominant, is hollow and dead. With the increased pressure to survive, for media to survive, who owns them and who runs them becomes the more important question than ever before. So if we want media that are conducive to the public interest, equal participation in the democratic deliberation, access to quality information, edification, social equality, in short, to the democracy of equals, we need to do away with the neoliberal media policy, its conflation of freedom of expression with freedom of markets, and its privileging of commercial media model. So, joint forces of disruptive technological innovation and economic forces have pulled the rug under the ailing traditional media and their production model. The consequences are evident. Journalism is being undercut by the processes of deskilling and layoffs. Media reporting is increasingly becoming uniform and reduced either to opinionated journalism and commentary, or agency news and press releases. The analysis and research is disappearing from the pages of the newspapers. However, the roots of these processes are not of recent making. Although internet is frequently blamed for undermining the business models, it has only precipitated the fundamental problems of media in contemporary capitalist democracies that have been set in motion with the growing concentration of media ownership and commodification of media content in the decades before the internet. These fundamentally structural processes will be discussed over the next 2.5 days, particularly tomorrow afternoon and on Saturday. At the same time, as said, the early democratizing promise of the internet to allow everyone to access the broadest public seems to have been eviscerated. In many ways, the success of internet has proved to be its failure, as it transformed our communication, our everyday, our economies. It failed to displace the dominant operations of social and global power. As the recent revelations of blanket surveillance of citizens had shown, it made everything that has become more democratic become, in fact, more fragile in the face of power. And we could claim that the same media policy and economic forces of concentration, commodification, and monopoly that drove the print and broadcasting media into a crisis decades ago are now driving the internet into a similar crisis. The growing economic streamlining of the media is foreclosing their democratic promise. So there are continuities here at work between the commercialization of media landscape and commercialization of early promissory internet. And they need to be understood regardless of the talk of new economy, long tails, funky business, gift economy. And no place better to start this conversation that we will continue tomorrow in the morning, than with the talk of our presenter this evening, Des Freedman. Des Freedman is a professor of media and communications at Goldsmiths, University of London. He's the author of several books, some of which are here. So, The Politics of Media Policy, I'll pass the books around later. He also co-authored with James Curran and Natalie Fenton, Misunderstanding the Internet. Let me show you this book, like that there. And he also co-edited another book which doesn't relate to the media field, but basically relates to the austerity cuts and the universities, the assault on universities, a manifesto for resistance. He has been previously our guest here in Zagreb as a trade union activist, discussing exactly cuts in higher education. But he is, in his academic work, interested in issues of media power and media reform, and his newest book, The Contradictions of Media Power, is coming out this autumn. Tonight's talk is a premiere of the argument in the book. So please apologize for this lengthy intro, and thank you for coming out here. Des, please take the floor.
Well, thank you to Tom for that introduction. Thanks for the invitation again. You very rarely get invited to one place twice. So thank you for that. Also, thank you for introducing the issues in a much more articulate and fluent way than I will be able to do. So you have utterly stolen any thunder that might have been coming my way. Anyway, I'm speaking in the wrong language, so I apologize immediately. And if I speak too quickly, please would you just heckle me? I would, if you came and spoke in Croatian to me, I would put my hand up. So if I end up, because I have a lot to get through, speaking too fast, please just tell me. And also, if you think that I'm just going on for too long and it's time for dinner or a drink, show that in the usual ways, however you do that here. But it's a big subject, and I thought the best way of starting out to think about some of the contradictions that we're facing with this very uncertain and volatile emerging environment is just to give you a kind of anecdote, I suppose. And it's about, it refers to a British journalist called Paul Mason, who wrote a fantastic book called Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere. Does anyone know that? I bet he's been to Zagreb and talked about, he's been everywhere. And it's an account of all the uprisings across, he was a BBC journalist who has now moved to Channel 4. So he's an esteemed broadcast journalist. And he sought to understand the progressive, the dynamics of the anti-austerity movements across Europe, and in particular to highlight, as he saw, the progressive role of social media for opposition movements. He argues that distributed platforms like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Flickr, and so on, together with new blogging tools, together with mobile phones, that all of these, he argues, have been essential in mobilizing publics to challenge dictatorships, to challenge authoritarian rule, to challenge injustice. According to Mason, he argues that, you will see that I don't completely agree with him by the end of what I'm saying, but it's a neat phrase. He argues that there is, quote, a technological fact that underpins the social and political aspects of what's happened across Europe. And this is it. You don't need to write this down, you can just remember it. A network can usually defeat a hierarchy. A network, he actually means a network will always defeat a hierarchy. This is the power of social media to challenge authoritarianism. So he's been evangelical about the political possibilities of social media. He wrote that 2011-12. He's done lots of talks about this. And then last year, so after talking about this for a couple of years, Mason was in utter despair about one particular social media platform, Twitter. And you probably won't know about this, but this was last summer, after a series of horrific rape and death threats were issued on Twitter to some British feminists who were actually just arguing for eminent British women to feature on banknotes. That was the full scale of their revolutionary demands, is that women should be on currency. And these women were faced with vile threats. This is an MP, a London MP. Unfortunately, you won't be able to, I hope you can't see the abuse, constant death threats for a couple of months. After witnessing this, Mason said that Twitter had become, in his words, quote, morally depopulated, and that he was now considering leaving Twitter. So he'd been theorizing and talking about and trying to join in Twitter revolutions in places like Egypt, Greece, Madrid, and so on. And then he sees this horrific stuff back in his own country, and he says, that's it, I am leaving Twitter. Now, what's the issue here? Now, it's certainly not Mason's outrage, which I completely share with him. It was utterly justified and proportionate. His solution was equally good, because he didn't call on governments just to lock everybody up. He actually called on Twitter users themselves to take action against the trolls, to expose them, and to make their lives very difficult. The issue for me is much more that Mason was surprised by this, that in a world which is marked by violence and discrimination against women and many other social groups, he was surprised that this kind of bigotry would make its way into the Twitter sphere. Mason wrote, quote, it will be a disaster if Twitter becomes dysfunctional. If Twitter becomes dysfunctional. But surely this assumes that Twitter or any other social media platform can ever be fully functional in the sense of maintaining only polite, respectful dialogue, a kind of very benign and democratic public sphere type approach. And in fact, when Mason argues that there has been a rise in the organized trolling of political opponents on Twitter, I would say that that's actually because there has been a steep rise in the UK in the number of Twitter users, not a sudden increase in racists and sexists suddenly discovering Twitter. Actually, for as long as we've had social media, and in particular the opportunity to abuse the anonymity that are offered by many of these platforms, we have always had trolls. You may remember a very old internet saying that goes, you can't have a picnic without ants. So in a way, why is Mason the most sophisticated journalist and sympathetic to the role of these technologies? Why was he so utterly horrified that something might have corrupted his beloved institution? Why would any of us expect even the most horrific offline behavior not to be reproduced online? So Twitter for me reflects, it's a kind of long opening anecdote. I'll probably be done. You'll be ready for dinner by the time I finished with Twitter. But Twitter for me reflects both the possibilities, I guess, of democratic exchange, as well as the serious problems, the inequalities between those who are best equipped and empowered to speak of the world in which it is located. It is true that Twitter does lower the cost of entry for people to communicate with each other. I have no idea how many of you even contemplate using Twitter as a dialogical form, as a rational form of communication. But it's also the case that not everyone is able to bring with them the same level of resources and influence, and therefore we have some important contradictions. So let me bore you with some statistics about this. First of all, that my maths isn't that good, but it's 0.05%, so that is 1/20th of 1%. Is that right? 1/20th of 1% of all Twitter users attract around about 50% of all attention on the network itself. A tiny proportion of people are responsible for most of the traffic on Twitter. Mason talks about the democracy of retweeting, but actually most tweets get no reaction at all. 71% of tweets are not retweeted, 85% are retweeted once, presumably by the parents or the younger sibling of the person, or the best friend of the person who tweeted. Twitter is a global phenomenon, it's true. Yet, the latest figures I have seen show me that 2 countries, the UK and the US, account for more than 2/3 of all the world's users. Yes, it's true that Twitter can be used to organize politically, but actually all the studies show that that is not the prime purpose by any means to which it is put. Far and ahead of politics or news or information are personal and work updates, which is obviously true if you stumble across Twitter late at night. You will see. Yes, it's true that Twitter is a platform that allows users to broaden their social networks, and it allows marginal voices to expose themselves or to become amplified. But it's also true that it's not done equally. That graph, you probably can't see it, but you can see it. The followers, over 4/5 of people follow fewer than 50 people. And actually, also in terms of followers and following, it's this same kind of very unequal picture. Most people follow or are followed by a very small number of people. 10% of Twitter account holders do not follow anyone. That's quite a good statistic. 10% of people who have signed up to Twitter do not follow a single person. Work that one out. Of course it's true that Twitter is a stimulus for activism and participation. I use it. I'm sure we all use it for those purposes. But it's the case, we should deal with the fact that nearly 50% of users check in very irregularly every couple of weeks. And this includes 21% who never check their accounts at all. They're kind of zombie Twitter users. I don't mean it's any disrespectful. It's probably a very intelligent and rational strategy to deal with a busy life. But most people are not. I was sitting at the back just before. I shouldn't do this. It's very antisocial. But most people do not do this. And there's another statistic. While hundreds of millions of tweets are sent every day, but actually, and I think this is the crucial fact here, that some 40% of registered Twitter users have never sent a tweet. 2/5 of all those people who have signed up have, not just they're not following anyone, that's a smaller number, they have themselves never sent a single tweet. They kind of consume the Twitter environment. Now, my point, I don't mean to pick on Twitter at all. All I'm trying to argue here is that the inequalities and disparities that we see in offline and in non-mediated environments are reproduced, not surprisingly, in social media platforms, where existing patterns of behavior, whether they are enlightened and progressive or reactionary, find an expression just as you would expect. So Twitter, for me, is not being dysfunctional when it carries hate speech. It's outrageous and it should be opposed, but I don't think you would say that it's being dysfunctional. It's actually reflecting the scars and the tensions of the dysfunctional environment from which it has emerged. And so for me, an understanding of these tensions is essential if we want to understand the environment, if we want to take advantage of emerging environments, as well as to deal with the challenges that are posed by emerging social media. And I think it's necessary if we're going to try and challenge some of the dominant narratives about the social media environment, which I'm going to come on to in a few minutes, and I would argue, to sum up this argument, that it's the idea that social media are effectively helping to democratize and equalize power relationships that have historically been very unequal and undemocratic. We really have to get to grips with this idea of the contradictions of these platforms if we're to take the technologies seriously. Now, how do you do this? Well, call me old-fashioned, but one of the most effective means, I think, of the tools for understanding contradiction is to go back to what Marx wrote about capitalism. As, you know, he may have been bowled over by all the beauties of capitalism as well as despairing of the exploitation, but he wrote very clearly about capitalism as a contradictory system. And he talked about the binary opposites, and I think when you talk, I'm sure we all do this, we talk about the internet, or no one here does this, but I'm sure you know people who do. They talk about the internet, we're using these binaries. Everything is either positive or negative. It's either progressive or reactionary, empowering or disempowering, and so on. It holds us back in really appreciating the system itself. And Marx allows us to think of contradiction not as this puzzling confusion, but actually to identify the tensions which are countervailing forces which are part of the system, a fundamental structure of the system itself. Now, contradiction is easy to use in lots of different ways. I mean, I remember I was thinking, what do you put on the cover of a book on contradiction? And I remember that there was a perfume called Contradiction, and I was very tempted just to put this perfume called Contradiction as the perfect commodification of the idea, but I thought that would be too bizarre, so I didn't do that. But many other people think of contradiction just as confusion. The world is contradictory, so it's a bit I'm baffled by it. And there are people who write about social media. One eminent writer who's written for a long time about the internet, David Weinberger, he has a new book on knowledge in the digital age, and he argues that, quote, we are a bundle of contradictions, the contradictions these days, because we adopt an on the one hand, on the other attitude towards the internet. Now, for me, that's a very subjective perception of contradiction. What he's doing there is illustrating our personal ambivalence and confusion in relation to the internet. For me, that's not what contradiction should allow us to do. We hold contradictory ideas not just because we are confused, although we probably are, but that's not the crucial point. It's because the world is a contradictory place, because the dominant social system that Marx identified as capitalism is structurally riddled with contradictions that cannot be wished away. Marx wrote that real contradictions exist and cannot be exorcised, wished away by imagination. You can't just idealistically pretend they don't exist. And of course, Marx speaks of the underlying tension between productive forces of capitalism, the technologies and skills that are available to us, that of course include social media at the moment, the contradiction between that and the social relations of capitalism. In other words, the social system which organizes the reproduction of these technologies. As the British theorist Ralph Miliband puts it, he talks about the contradiction, he calls it a supreme contradiction between capitalism's ever more social character and its enduringly private purpose. So you have all these contradictions at the heart of the world in which we live, between use value and exchange value, between the social character of production and its private appropriation. And all of these, I think, are central to the analysis of any technological and media system that are operating under the conditions we face today. So if you think about these binaries, this debate between digital optimists, I mean, it's terrible we have to think like this, but a debate between digital optimists and digital pessimists about whether platforms facilitate transparency or opacity, whether it facilitates scarcity or abundance, and so on. The point is that these platforms and technologies can facilitate both at the same time. So you don't choose one or the other. It is entirely possible that social media are tools of both empowerment and control, that the internet is subject to centrifugal and centripetal forces, that the web both encourages new voices and privileges existing traditional powerful voices. So I think by accentuating an approach that acknowledges these kinds of contradictions, we can avoid the pitfalls of this simplistic binary approach. And it helps us, I think, to challenge the more naive, the more utopian technological determinism, which I think lies behind much of the discourse around social media today. There are different kinds of discourses. I want to concentrate on one set of arguments, of positive utopian arguments about how the internet is equalizing and democratizing. And these are the kinds of books, I don't know what kind of bookshop you have in Zagreb airport, but you go to Heathrow airport where it's a bookshop, it's a retail, it's a supermarket with some planes that fly through it. So it's mostly shops. And they sell you these business books which have a common theme in their understanding, I would see, of the democratizing power of the internet. Probably one of the best new ones, and again, I don't know you as an audience, but has anyone come across this wonderfully useful book? You note my caution here. I'm not really, it's useful because it illustrates a particular discourse about the internet. The New Digital Age, which is written by this perfect editorial combination of the state and the market. Eric Schmidt is the executive chairman of Google, and Jared Cohen is the director. Now he's the director of Google Ideas, but he was the State Department, the American State Department official who developed the concept a few years back under Hillary Clinton of 21st century statecraft, which is effectively about empowering youth in the Arab Spring with social media platforms. That was their idea. Instead of just dropping bombs, maybe we should use social media in order to, it's a kind of soft power. So they're both important people in these new, in this new kind of environment. And what a lot of these new theorists talk about is the transformation of power. They focus on power. I haven't made this up because I've written something on power. This is at their heart, the heart of their analysis, that digital media are unraveling a form of power that was previously the privilege of a tiny group of people. This is their argument, and I could honestly speak till midnight to go through all the different ways in which they do this, but I won't. But let's pick on Schmidt and Cohen just to start with. They write that, and they travel the world doing this. It's not just a book. This is the script for their interventions across the world. They write that the most significant impact of the spread of communication technologies will be the way they help reallocate the concentration of power away from states and institutions. They're reallocating power away from states and institutions and transferring it to who? No, they wouldn't, not to business. Who said that? Not to business. Of course they wouldn't say business. They might mean it, but they would never say that. No, power is being diffused away to a certain extent from big businesses, maybe small businesses, but it's diffused away from powerful corporations and states and towards us, individuals. Thank you very much. Yes. And this is the kind of argument that you just find all the time. Another book by Nico, The End of Big, that's Nico Melli, an important geopolitical actor as well. He writes that the former Venezuelan trade minister under a previous, not under Chavez, not surprisingly, but again, he travels the world. His argument is that radical connectivity is altering the exercise of power faster than we can understand it, and that this involves, for him, a radical redistribution of power. I could go on. There's other important people about this. Jeff Jarvis, who's a journalism professor in New York, who has written many, many books and articles about the importance of social media and the way it's redefined journalism for the good. He wrote a book called What Will Google Do? And he says that Google has inspired a grassroots revolution in business and entertainment that's based on creativity, participation, and openness. And for him, quote, "This is what we mean when we talk about power shifting to the edge, no longer centralized. Again, this is the clear metaphorical and material impact of digital media. Chris Anderson, another famous, he was the former editor of Wired, the Bible of the high-tech revolution in the US, and he wrote some very well-known and interesting books on free and the long tail. Is that familiar to people? Chris Anderson's book on it's taught in business schools around the world now. And his main argument was that digital distribution of content has produced many different shifts in the balance of power, from big bureaucratic music companies to fans, to bands and to fans. The shift has been from the big label to bands and music audiences themselves. The shift has gone from mass to niche, from top down to bottom up. That is the shift of power that we are seeing, and therefore power relations are in flux thanks to digital technologies. And actually, this is a slightly, there he is. That's Chris Anderson on the long tail. I'll come back to this argument in a minute. It's not an entirely new argument. This is the kind of book, Power Shift, that if you're in Britain or America, you find Alvin Toffler's books in the remainder section. They're quite cheap to buy. They produced so many in the 1970s and 80s because it was such a big argument that you can get hold of them. One of them was called Power Shift. This was pre-internet, but predicting the impact of electronic and soon-to-be digital technologies. And here, we're not just seeing a shift for Toffler in the balance of power, in other words, who might be said to hold power, or just the direction of its flow. Actually, we're seeing a shift in the very composition and texture of power. He says that a power shift does not merely transfer power, it transforms power. This is a technological argument. Power is transformed. So it's not just a shift of power from one person to another or from state to individuals. It's a change in the underlying relationships facilitated through these relationships. This debate has been circulating, and I guess one of the most influential now accounts is that given by Manuel Castells in his, 5 years old now, his book on communication power, where he argues that information networks provide the infrastructure, they provide the actual backbone for the exercise of and the resistance to power. The capacity to exercise influence in any sphere of life has been, according to Castells, informatized, digitalized, to such an extent that power relationships are programmed inside communication systems. And he argues, quote, power in the network society is communication power. That's what it is. Power is communication power. Now, he's not saying that we're seeing the end of power at all. We're just seeing its redefinition and relocation inside information systems so that you get new people who are the holders of power. In particular, those people who have the ability to control and work across the different networks. As Castells calls them, the switchers, the people who can switch from one network of elite finance to communications. So the archetypal person who holds switching power is, you won't be surprised to hear for him, Rupert Murdoch. I am sure, I don't know the names of the Croatian media power switchers, but obviously there will be those. And so the ability to switch in an informatized society gives you enormous power. Now, I could go on. There are many more accounts, all of which privilege the impact of digital technologies and draw attention to what they see as a fundamental redefinition, often in very democratic and progressive ways, through the sheer logic of social media, of digital media. That's the theory that is put to us. So I want to do now in 20 minutes. Do I still have 20 minutes? You can stay with me for that? Right. That's the theory. Let's actually look, because some of you may completely sympathize with that, and who am I to argue against it? So I will try and argue against it, and hopefully you will then argue back. if we still have the energy. So what I want to do in the rest of the talk is to explore two particular claims that are made in relation to this world of possibility, this new world of bottom-up flows of power. Two particular ones. One is around the argument that existing centers of power are fragmenting given the decentralizing logic of network communications. That's the first. And secondly, that social media platforms are enabling those previously without a voice to link to each other without the need for intermediaries, without the need for, as it's more commonly seen, without the need for middlemen. And this is the process, and it's a very ugly word, but we have to use it, of disintermediation. All it means is cutting out the middleman, and that this is precisely what digital media have done, to cut out the nasty, mean, and undemocratic middlemen and women who were responsible for putting blockages in the flow of communication. So those are the two processes that are at the heart of many of the arguments, and I'll just focus on them for the rest of the talk. So decentralization first and disintermediation second. Is the speed okay? Great. Right, well, decentralization. Despite the rhetoric about unfettered competition and the triumph of the long tail, remember, this is the idea that actually that what is important about digital media is the fact that it enables a huge amount of choice, which may not be the blockbusters, but there's endless choice in record shops because they're online, which allows for more obscure niche material, and you can transfer this argument to news as well. In other words, that there is much more capacity for having a huge diversity of views along this long tail, and all that we used to see was just the head. Now what's more important is the long tail. My simple thesis around this is that the structure of the digital media economy, I mean, Tom made the point very clearly, but I'll repeat you, that the digital media economy looks sadly, none of this is rejoicing in it. It looks sadly a lot like the structure of the analog economy, that it is marked by dominant players in all of its sectors. Now, what's weird is actually you're seeing not just the opposite, not just a deconcentration, you are seeing the intensification of media concentration played out in different sectors. Now, this is not an accident, because there is an inbuilt advantage, as we know, in a networked environment for first movers, for those companies who come along first onto the scene, given that the value of a network increases exponentially the more people join the network. This is called network effects, which means that despite the radical differences attributed to it by so many of these wonderful business theorists whose books you can buy at the airport, there's actually little reason to expect an internet economy, a digital economy, to develop differently from any other industry that is based around networks. According to Tim Wu, who's written very well on these subjects, for all its supposed singularity, the internet shows itself, like any network, to be subject to network economics with efficiencies naturally arising from central control. Economies of scale, a leading story of the 20th century, of the analog world, is already playing out in this 21st century. So the upshot of this, the upshot of network economics is monopolistic and sometimes actually highly, is either oligopolistic or sometimes highly monopolistic control of key areas of the online economy, as we know. I could pick on lots of different arguments, so I'll just concentrate on a few. Just think of search. Now, Microsoft has invested many, I don't have the latest figures, but it has invested many billions of dollars into search, into its Bing search engine. Does anyone in this room, and please tell the truth, does anyone in this room use Bing? I mean, either the people at Microsoft are stupid, which they are not, or else they lack power, which they do not, or else they came up against a very good rival in the name of Google. They invested billions of dollars. And I can't remember what the latest, the share around the world is, I think, something like 2.5% that Microsoft, this is given the fact that they still manage to have a significant control of desktop computers. Google, it's very uneven, but Google has something like, globally, it's a 2/3 control of market share in search. Given the huge importance of Chinese web users, their search engine, Baidu, has something, it's still under 10%. And actually, Google's monopoly is much higher when it comes to mobiles and tablets, something like 90%. Now, of course, it is true that it is different in different countries, that in Russia, you have Yandex, Baidu, as I've already referred to. Both of them have a dominant share in their home countries, but I think Google's hegemony is a perfect illustration of network effects operating inside what are presented to us as hyper-competitive digital markets. In the UK, a liberalised and very competitive society, Google has over 90% of the search market, as against 4% for Bing. In the US, it's 67%, Bing has 18%. Now, I tried to do justice to the Croatian digital scene to find the latest figures on Google, and I failed. All I could find was 2011, but it does not paint a very good picture of Croatian plurality. At 2011, unless this was a typographical error, Google had a 98.58% market share. So please tell me that this has gone down significantly, but maybe it doesn't look like you'll say. Now, you find these kinds of oligopolistic markets all across the digital world. Online book publishing is growing rapidly, but what we don't have is a plurality of providers. Amazon has a 60% share of the US market, and I think quite incredible, a 90% share of the British ebook market. 90%. This is supposed to be a world which is decentralizing, and we have a monopolistic provider in the ebook world. As a publisher, this is more power than any traditional publishers ever had. What about when it comes to digital downloads, which was, as I said, the original inspiration for Anderson's long tail thesis? There's been all sorts of, in the heart of business inside the academy, challenges to this long tail thesis, actually saying that you still find a domination of the blockbuster, and that Anderson has vastly overrated the importance of the long tail. People have studied Netflix and concluded that hits are still driving the markets, but more than the other way round. I look at something more recent, app production. I mean, it's hard to get lots of figures on lots of this, but app production, that surely, call me naive, but there is something about the production of apps that you do kind of think may be the old image of a couple of young men, probably still young men, in a garage somewhere, but with their computers, not with cars. That apps is more of a cottage industry. You would hope, you would think, app production maybe is less concentrated than global search, but the fact is a handful of companies dominate. You have 25 developers generating half of all app revenue. A small handful, even in this relatively new area. According to the Wall Street Journal, around 2% of the top 250 app publishers are newcomers. Only 2% are newcomers, with most app markets having a difficult time. These are the Wall Street Journal's words, not mine. They're having a difficult time breaking into a business dominated by incumbents, says the Wall Street Journal. And the long tail structure of the app market, I think, is further undermined by the fact that some 2/3 of apps in the Apple Store are zombies. Apps which are rarely, if ever, downloaded by consumers. They're just sitting there. So it's the opposite, in a way, of a genuine democratic choice and vibrant market. So I would say that this challenges the claims that digital markets have decisively shifted power from the center to the periphery, from elites to ordinary users. Of course, there's a certain unpredictability to an emerging market. And of course, there are real centers of innovation. And there are the 18-year-olds coming up with an idea. But what do the 18-year-olds do, as the founders of Google do? Do they sit on top of this, and do they go to their university, or do they go to their local council and say, here is this wonderful app, or whatever it may be? What happens to them? Well, we know they get bought up. That's the logic of the system we work under. Google has spent over $20 billion acquiring it. When I last counted, you have to count, it takes a long time. You have to go to Wikipedia and count every single one of their acquisitions. The last I counted was 127 companies. Now, Google is seen as, you know, the epitome of this bottom-up grassroots company that was just the two American guys in a garage. The way they cement their power is through acquiring the creativity of others. I'm not criticizing, that's capitalism, that's accumulation strategies. And of course, the most famous recent example of this is, what does Facebook do with its surplus cash? It spends $20 billion acquiring WhatsApp, partly to stop anyone else acquiring WhatsApp. So what you're having is corporate domination of individual sectors, search, apps, e-publishing, and so on, is complemented at the same time by growing antagonism as these giant companies are trying to ward off future competition and protect their revenue streams. And so you're finding really fierce competition, which is taking place in particular around online advertising markets. And the business press is all the time talking about, in their words, a turf war. Does that make sense? It's, you know, the military metaphors of a war between these different giant social media companies to hegemonize the area of advertising. They describe it as, The Economist was describing this battle between Google, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon as, quote, an epic story of warring factions in a strange and changing landscape, a tale of incursions and sieges, of plots and betrayals, of battlefield brilliance and cunning with coin. Do you know what program they're referring to when they're describing? This is the Game of Thrones that they're talking about as applied to the real-life war between our dominant social media giants. Of course, the focus in this Game of Thrones is always firmly on the barons, the lords, never on the serfs and the peasants. So I would say that we are seeing not decentralization, as has been theorized, but centralization. My last example is around disintermediation, which I think is particularly, I just think it's interesting. The decentralization, you know, there's all sorts of economic data, and in a way it's not surprising. I think the arguments around disintermediation are more important, because this is where, you know, it's the power of the individual to relate to other individuals without the need for giant intermediaries. This is what we feel must be true about social media. And there are all sorts of ways that I'll try and describe very quickly. So you have this particularly important quality of distributed networks, as they're seen, that follows on from their structural urge to decentralize, is this ability to facilitate direct connections between dispersed users without the need for mediating bodies, without the need for middlemen. And so this process of disintermediation, excuse the term, has allowed bands to, for example, sell or give music to fans without the need for labels. It's allowed advertisers to communicate with consumers without the need for classified ads in newspapers. It's allowed film buffs to exchange information about and opinions about other film buffs without the need for professional film critics. It's allowed authors to reach readers without publishers. This is a good thing. If it was true, you would say this is a good and democratic development, that the internet has facilitated a more direct form of exchange. So disintermediation, according to this logic, has severely disrupted the business models of, in particular, the newspaper, publishing, and music industries, which we know is certainly true. That it has undermined the authority of elites and has equalized the balance of power between what were previously seen as very distinct producers on the one hand and consumers on the other hand, between professionals on the one hand and amateurs and that a more disintermediated media environment would do away with these polar opposites because of we're all what's the phrase, prosumers. We're a combination of producer and consumer now. Now, at one level, this is clearly true. It refers to very significant and real developments that speak to some of the things that all of us in this room do in our day-to-day cultural creative existences. The sheer number of YouTube clips, tweets, blog comments, Flickr photographs, and Facebook posts demonstrates that a vast amount of labor is performed by ordinary users in their attempt to communicate with their peers, and actually sometimes even to organize ourselves as publics. But what I think is overlooked, what is less frequently analyzed, is the extent to which the disintermediating properties of digital technologies can be said to automatically, and this is what is put by the business literature, can be said to automatically lead to the disappearance of influential intermediaries in a manner which would suggest the meaningful transition of power away from the many, from the few to the many. And this is what I have a problem with. So is that clear, my argument? It's the business proposition is that the technologies themselves, because of their structural predisposition to get rid of the middleman, means that we are likely to have this shift of power from elites to ordinary publics. Now, Manuel Castells deals with this point a little bit because he talks about the digital age delivering radical new forms of, in his phrase, it's mass self-communication. That's his phrase, mass self-communication, that for him has stimulated unprecedented autonomy for communicative subjects to communicate at large. So we have much more autonomy in our creative roles. He does recognize, I should say, that this potential for autonomy is shaped, controlled, and curtailed by the growing concentration and interlocking of corporate media and network operators around the world. Far from diminishing the importance of media moguls and tech giants, announcing the death of gatekeepers or lauding the autonomy of the public, actually we need to investigate very specifically, in detail, using empirical data, the ways in which power, for me, is being reconstituted inside a digital landscape, and that we have not seen by any means the death of the middleman. So there's little doubt that disintermediation has disrupted the market. I have no argument with that. Of course it has. If you're in newspapers, how could you argue otherwise? The internet is now second only to television in terms of advertising revenue in the US. From what I could gather of the slides that Milan was putting up, my creation is not that good, but it looked like the internet was nearly the second most important source of advertising revenue. If not yet, it will be. That's what the trend is likely to be in Croatia as anywhere else. Given that search, for example, accounts for 45% of all online advertising, and that Google dominates search, this obviously, for example, just talking about Google, puts Google in an incredibly powerful position. This is even more the case because Google is able to deal directly with clients without the need, as it used to require, for dedicated ad agencies. As Michael Wolff, the American business writer about the media, has argued, Google is an incredibly efficient system for placing ads, he says. In a disintermediated advertising market, the company has turned itself into the last and the ultimate middleman. It has got rid of some of the traditional middlemen, the advertising agencies, but because of its domination of search and its ability to have these direct relationships, what has happened is that Google has positioned itself as the probably most important intermediary between the public and all sorts of other corporate bodies. So power may be shifting, but it appears to be displacing previously dominant distributors like book publishers, music companies, or ad agencies in favor of new corporate intermediaries rather than automatically empowering the public itself. Just think about the recent evolution of the e-publishing market. Now, this is a sector, as I said, that is hugely dominated by Amazon, whose founder and Jeff Bezos, who now owns the Washington Post, so he's moved from selling useless objects into controlling one of America's most influential newspapers. He attributes the success of Amazon to its, quote, self-service approach that frees, these are his words, it's Amazon's self-service approach that frees customers from the tyranny of middlemen. Now, he wrote that in all honesty. I don't think he's being disingenuous. He's not telling a lie. I think what's so scary is he believes that. He believes that his company, that dominates so many of the markets it's in, is popular because it shows the need to get rid of middlemen. Just think about that concept, which he obviously didn't. He wrote to Amazon shareholders, quote, even well-meaning gatekeepers slow innovation. He's declared war. This is the man who started Amazon has declared war on intermediaries. Even well-meaning gatekeepers slow innovation, whereas Amazon, he says, simply empowers others to unleash their creativity, to pursue their dreams. Of course, this death of the middleman has been very good business for Amazon, allowing it to dominate so many different markets. Now, gatekeeping isn't just a matter of economic control as well. I think what I'm arguing is you will find these, if not traditional, but certainly new gatekeepers coming in. But the role of the gatekeeper has not diminished. And I think we are seeing the intensification of gatekeeping as a process. And you see it in all sorts of different and very important ways. Let's just think about blogging, my last example, honestly. Think about blogging, posting, and uploading that we all do. Now, these appear to be highly disintermediated activities. Who gets in the way of you informing and illuminating the world about your latest theoretical discovery? You know, you go on WordPress. You don't need an editor to tell you anything. It feels like it is a truly disintermediated activity. The problem is, of course, all of these types of activities are subject to the process of moderation and surveillance, which are undertaken by both computers and humans. Let me give you one example. There was a great story in the New York Times back in 2008. Jeffrey Rosen spent time, one of those big feature articles about this whole subject. And Jeffrey Rosen spent quite a long time with Nicole Wong, who at the time was the Deputy General Counsel of Google. And he was trying to get to grips with precisely this question of what is the level of mediation that Google is engaged with. So he just hung out with her in California, trying to understand and talking to Nicole Wong and her team about how they decided what material was appropriate or not for Google's many services across the world. And reflecting on the values and beliefs that Wong brought to bear on very complex decisions concerning the balance between, for example, free speech and the avoidance of harm, Rosen concluded that, quote, Wong and her team arguably have more influence over the contours of online expression than anyone else on this planet. They are presiding over what appears to us to be unmediated expression. And it is a very small group of people who are sitting there using algorithms to decide on whether the content we generate is permissible or not. We don't tend to think about that because we're just so pleased that we got our blog out, that someone may read it. So decisions on whether YouTube, for example, should allow jihadist videos, whether Google should permit searches about Tiananmen in China. There was a big controversy at this time about whether its then social networking site Orkut should tolerate attacks on a particular hardline nationalist party in India. All of these were day-to-day decisions that a tiny group of them made in a room in wherever it is, Mountain View in California. The team led by Wong, who actually went on to become the legal director of Twitter and then the chief privacy officer at the White House, because this is how things go. Guess what that team was called? This is in the world where the internet has facilitated disintermediation. This team, who are equipped with so much power, are formally known as the Deciders. This is how they're known at Google, the Deciders. And of course there are deciders at all the major social media companies who are faced with these kinds of decisions about how best to manage content, deal with hate speech, protect freedom of expression, and so on. And actually Rosen followed this article up last year in another equally interesting article, and he was discussing how some internet companies are exploring the possibility of a purely algorithmic, because we know that the world has been liberated by algorithms, that many companies are exploring the possibility of an algorithmic approach to content screening in order to minimize subjective human bias. He actually describes this as, quote, an engineer's response to a thorny historical and legal problem. In other words, you get the humans out, maybe you'll get out the worst middlemen, and it will make it more transparent and objective. The problem is this will do very little to ensure objectivity, partly because algorithms are as susceptible to bias as the human decisions that are embedded within the algorithms to start with. A report for the Nieman Journalism Lab provides a fascinating account of how news aggregators and summarizers that rely on a series of ranking, optimization, and personalization algorithms are completely dependent on the data that is fed into them, as well as the criteria that are used to help them make inclusion, exclusion, and emphasizing decisions. These are all utterly human, subjective decisions which structure the algorithmic operations that then follow. The other fact is that algorithms do nothing to change the fact that what is allegedly disintermediated speech is subject to filtering systems at so many different levels. Evgeny Morozov, who I'm sure some of you have come across, he reveals how, and this is so depressing, again, I'm ending very short, and I hate to be negative about this, but tough. Morozov reveals how some of the most popular grassroots blogs that we are likely to use, like Tumblr and WordPress. How many of us in this room use Tumblr and WordPress? Okay, well, it's more than use Bing anyway, so it's more significant. They run their comments through third-party controlled algorithms that check for spam, check for malware, and check for harmful content without making it at all clear what these algorithms are based on, and therefore what they understand, for example, to constitute hate speech. These aren't pure, objective, independent processes. They are fed and actually supervised by humans structuring the algorithmic operations. This lack of transparency is compounded, he argues, by the extra layers that are being added to speech acts that are celebrated as evidence of a more open and dispersed form of communication. And in fact, what Morozov argues is that, quote, it is the proliferation. You won't read this in probably those business books. His conclusion is that the proliferation, not elimination, of intermediaries has made blogging so widespread. The right term for Morozov, in his words, is not disintermediation, but hyper-intermediation. Hyper-intermediation. Right, I think I better finish. So what I'm saying is we need to take very seriously the arguments of those theorists who insist that power now flows benignly from the periphery and that concentrated ownership and monopolistic behavior is a mere historical memory in the digital age. And we need to integrate these claims into a perspective that acknowledges the contradictory development of social relations. So while the internet has certainly facilitated the possibility of the broader circulation of marginal voices and the potential reconstitution of publicness, is that Yavnost? Am I anywhere near it? Something, right? That's the possibility. Many of the claims that are made about digital technologies in terms of this technological capacity to decentralize and disintermediate, they are overstated, they lack context, and they are at times simply wrong about the transformation of power that these commentators and entrepreneurs see as structurally attached to digital technologies in everyday life. Instead, as far as I can see, corporate power, far from disappearing in recent years, is flourishing and has adapted itself to meet the challenges, as we would expect it to, of the digital economy. Distributed technologies have led to the abolition neither of the laws nor the contradictions of capitalism, but have offered a range of both existing and new organizations the capacity to secure customers for their goods and services. Capitalism has not dispersed. Social media have simply helped capitalism to develop a far more effective way to market dispersion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I would like to pose the question about, you brilliantly elaborated problems of technological determinism, the idea that rather technology is democratizing our world or it is totalizing it is rather a strange and a wrong question. The both pictures are equally problematic because of the reductionism. So I would agree on that. But it is, I would be skeptical on the conclusion that we only need to address internet as centralized media, that Morozov suggestion about selectivism rather than hacktivism, you know, I suppose that you know that argument that there is no real activism on the internet, that it is a false activism. Morozov show in one example that one hacktivist action of stalk Fontaine in Copenhagen was totally false, and one person made it up. So thousands of signatures were collected on that fact. But of course, what I'm skeptical about is the question that it is centralized media we are talking about, and that we should address it as centralized media. Rather than that, I would stress the fact that there are few cases that shows conflictual character of the distributed media that you mentioned. So instead to follow regular neoliberal songs of democratization, and that Google evangelist, it is the term that Google actually uses for those guys that are writing those books, we should insist on the conflicts and conflictual character of the internet in Marx's sense. And those conflicts that you mentioned but did not elaborate it, maybe you could comment on that, are conflicts of production forces and relations in production. Intellectual property rights are one case of such conflict, conflictual character of production forces on the one hand and relations in production on the other. Aaron Schwartz's case clearly shows that there are conflictual characters, conflictual cases of the internet. Snowden case, Assange case shows that there are conflictual moments. On the other hand, of course, Arab Spring and the thank you Facebook messages was not something that we should clap our hands on. So if you could comment on that.
Tom, do you want me to come now, answer that now? Well, first of all, and it's a great question. Morozov is, how can I put this? He's being, I would say, polemical. He is responding. I mean, I think he's wrong. He's far too crude. But he's crude for a reason, which is he has been driven nuts by what he sees as a handful of very powerful people monopolizing arguments about the transformative potential, political and economic, of social media. And so he is reacting, or you could say overreacting, and therefore just trying to draw attention to the hypocrisy of what he sees as many of the people in the State Department. And I think he's absolutely right to do that, because this has guided diplomacy. This was at the heart of the State Department's, of one section of the State Department's intervention in the Arab Spring. I've talked to people who thought that arming people with laptops would be what democracy needed in Egypt at the time. They truly believed. Now, of course, it's classic ideological warfare. It's a form of soft power. And I think Morozov is right to address in very, very hard terms that kind of, it's not naivety, it's very, I think you see it's much more than that. It's dangerous because it ignores the extent to which the most powerful organizations are able to spy, survey, take control of the technologies which, if we are not warned about them, he worries we would put too much faith in. But of course, it would be wrong, therefore, to think that there are not the uses that you're saying. And that's the whole point about understanding contradiction and conflict, or placing them at the heart of our understanding. So we have both at the same time. We have resistance, and we have, well, whatever the opposite is. We have a use of social media to reinforce inequality and maintain power in place, and we have its simultaneous opposition. And therefore, it's the binary opposites are what have marked discussion of the internet. People have felt that you have to be in one ghetto or another. They wouldn't use that word. And that mistakes what I think is a much more productive way of thinking about the technologies. So there are conflicts in every aspect of development. I mean, intellectual property is marked by so many divisions and conflicts, it's hard to know where to start, not least between the different groups who wish to take control of intellectual property. That's one of the major battles. But of course, one of the most vibrant areas, we're going to talk about this tomorrow in terms of media reform, one of the most vibrant areas of media reform is precisely over intellectual property, where there are a whole range of initiatives, practical, ideological, at all levels, both engaging with official and actually just, hacktivist networks, which are saying we are not going to operate on the terms that you have given us. So there is a conflict at the heart of it, and I think that's what drives my understanding of this. But the fact is that all too often we need to aim a lot of our ammunition at the people who are making the arguments that, in my opinion, are probably the most dangerous, precisely because they have the most influence. So I don't really need to, those people who are using the internet, who are using social media as part of ongoing struggles, they don't need to listen to me about this. I should be listening to them. I have a lot to learn from them. But what I do think we need to be doing is posing a practical and intellectual challenge to these arguments. And I say that because I think a lot of what I've said is completely obvious. You say it and you are attacked in the academy. You are dismissed as knowing nothing about the internet. You are marginalized because that's what power seeks to do. So I completely agree with you. Start with the conflicts, with the recognition that this is, like other aspects of the world in which we live, marked and riven by conflicts. But I do think we need to address very clearly the arguments that the most powerful people are making, precisely because they're trying to be our friends.
Thank you very much again for an interesting talk. I have a comment that is, I guess, also a question. I was wondering, shouldn't we talk about two levels of disintermediation? Because basically you talked most of the time about the ideological side of it, where supposedly the users have much more power, they can avoid hierarchical structures, etc. And of course we know that there's a lot of data mining, filtering, algorithmic control and everything. But on the other hand, shouldn't we also talk about disintermediation as a source of power through actual value extraction by Google? And by value extraction, I mean in a sense that, for example, Google in 2013 had a global revenue of $60 billion, and out of that revenue, 2/3 were just pure profit. So $40 million were just pure profit. Now, the way that Google can do that is by avoiding intermediaries, and I'm not talking about users, I'm talking about nation states, avoiding taxation systems, avoiding workers' rights, etc. So I was wondering about the connection between the economic side of value generation and extraction and the ideological side of the digital discourse that legitimizes this value extraction.
I think you've answered your question that they're both absolutely crucial, but I mean obviously the ideological arguments that are posed are precisely there to naturalize the kinds of models that they operate. So I didn't go through any of the debates around digital labor, around free labor, the astonishing amounts of money that are presided over by these emerging companies. I mean, we should think Google is nowhere compared to Apple. The amount of, which has a more old-fashioned business model, it's true, that it is not just relying on free labor. But I mean, Google's $100 billion surplus, it doesn't know what to do with this money. Think of what could be done, really. Think of what the Croatian government could do with a tiny proportion of that money to reinvigorate a media system which would only benefit Apple in the end. Anyway, we get back to Google and the amount of revenue extracted from freely given labor is essential to its business model, and I think it's no coincidence that this argument is then wrapped up, that this is precisely about new modes of communication, that it is decentralized, that it is bottom-up, that allows it to be painted in a particular way and preempts the sorts of challenges that people try to make. And it's very hard to make a challenge, pay me for my content. I mean, of course, we know there are campaigns that do this. It's kind of hard because people, are often reluctant to upset something they still ideologically think is free. And again, it's another argument we need to have to try and strip this away. And I think you're absolutely right. And not enough people make this argument that one of the components of the disintermediation is their transcendence above the normal rules of the financial markets. Now, they pick and choose their transcendence, because when it comes to intellectual property, they're absolutely wedded to proprietorial forms of behavior. We know this from the very famous statement written by the two Google founders to the Securities and Exchange Commission when they were doing the float for Google. What did they write? They were what, mid-20s? Sergey Brin wrote it, I believe. They were in their mid-20s. It was a very sophisticated document they wrote saying to would-be shareholders, believe us, we are absolutely committed to the viability and the rigorous nature of intellectual property. They weren't going to give it away. So they built that in. But when it comes to other forms of transcendence, in other words, not paying taxes, of having the most amazing accounting practices, then they're very skilled at that. So I think those two dimensions really do, they absolutely fit together. So I didn't mean to separate them, the ideological and the economic. I mean, disintermediation at heart is, of course, it's a profoundly important economic process when you're a journalist. We know how it has reshaped the business of journalism and actually many of the practices now. But I think that is only one element, that we need to think of all the other ways in which disintermediation is being processed, and we are coming up with these very new, very powerful new gatekeepers.
Okay, maybe one last question.
It's about so-called connected continent strategy of European Commission, and it's not about free roaming. But what's your position on an effort of European Commission to build, as they call it, European single market of telecommunications, especially in terms of which the strategy is aiming into building bigger telecommunication companies, bigger internet providers, because the European Commission is finds that European internet providers are too small comparing to American and Asian competition. Especially the issue is probably interesting, especially from that point of view of, do you think it could cause merging of intermediators, ISPs, and the content owners?
Well, if I was a very large economic bloc governed by neoliberal principles in competition with very significant rivals both in Asia and in North America, I would do the same. But that's not where I stand. And my question to them is, what role do ordinary users and citizens have both in the decision-making process, and at what level have they been consulted about the kinds of, the end game in any of this? And I think you'll find, as far as I could see, it's a very, very limited role that they've had. This is not the bottom-up, user-generated policy making that one would hope to see, but we shrug our shoulders. Of course it isn't. It's one neoliberal trading bloc in competition with another, and it is in their interests to build up giant, vertically structured, if that's what they feel is most effective, companies, doing what, to a certain extent, we found with 20th century media companies before they grew too big and under popular pressure, some of them were broken apart. Come now to the 21st century, I think we were likely to see the reconstitution of different elements in the value chain put together to make them stronger, to make them more viable. But in what way does that benefit the citizen in terms of price, in terms of connection, in terms of genuine competition, in terms of a genuine movement against surveillance, in terms of a genuine movement for a kind of commons? I'm, as you can tell, waiting for the answer from them.
Okay, so I want to thank you once again for your talk and your answers.